what those models say fundamentally is that if you're moving towards a target, a consumatory target, which would be specified by hypothalamic or other underlying motivational systems, or some combination of those, sometimes it can be a higher order goal, then anything that occurs while you're proceeding towards that goal that indicates that you're going to get it or move closer to it produces positive emotion. Okay? And that's mediated by the hypothalamic exploratory positive affect circuit that runs through the nucleus accumbens, and it basically runs on dopamine. Okay, so that's positive emotion, roughly speaking. It's positive emotion in relationship to incentive reward. What happens if you attain the goal, which is the consumatory reward, is it satisfies you. And that's also a form of reward, but it's not associated with as much positive emotion. It's more associated with the lack of necessity to do that anymore, you know, so you're done with that, and that can be satisfying, and it does seem to be mediated by serotonin, which is basically a satiating agent among its other properties. Okay, so that's on the positive emotion end of things. Briefly, an incentive reward is also equivalent to a conditioned reward in classical behavior theory. So that's actually something you should probably know, but I'll talk about it a bit more. Because you kind of need to know how behaviorist theory developed across time, because behaviorist theory has been incredibly, and still is, incredibly influential in neuroscience, especially in the real neuroscience, which is almost always done with animals. So that's on the positive emotion end. Now, let's go to the negative emotion end. So now you're proceeding towards a goal, and something gets in your way. You're walking across the carpet to go to work and you step on a dog bone, you know, and that's maybe a little painful, but we'll keep that apart from this discussion for a moment. It constitutes an impediment to your progress forward. Or maybe your kid left you know, like a piece of furniture in the hallway. That's a better example. So it's a bit of an obstacle, and when you look at that, then that's going to produce negative emotion, and the negative emotion is because there's an obstacle in your path. Now, you might say, how much negative emotion should you experience when you encounter an obstacle? And that's something that, I don't remember if I assigned you guys the entropy paper that I wrote with Jacob Hirsch and Raymond Marr, but anyways, we took a long time to figure out how you might calibrate how upset you should get when something negative happens. And what we realized fundamentally was that it was proportional to the place in the hierarchy where your goals were disrupted. You know, so if you just have to make a minor course correction by walking around, the amount of upset you should get is basically proportional to the amount of extra energy that you have to expend correcting your course. And so a minor obstacle is just going to, you know, produce a little bit of arousal and stress, whereas if you go out to try to start your car and it won't start, well, then that's going to make you more upset, experience more negative emotion, you know. And if you read that the business you work in has just collapsed because the CEO was a crook and now it's bankrupt, that's going to cause you even more distress. And the distress, roughly speaking, should be proportional to the level of the hierarchy in your expectancy network, or desire network more accurately, that's disrupted by the occurrence. Okay? So, and that makes sense, it's solid. And then, you know, then there's the special case of things you don't know about. You know, so, and often when something gets in your way, the problem with what gets in your way is you actually can't compute how much time and energy it's going to take you to fix it. And so it's very hard to calibrate how much negative emotion you're going to feel under those circumstances, right? Like, for example, how anxious should you get if your car quits working? Well, the answer to that is, you don't know. And because maybe it'll never work again, you know? And then it would depend on, well, you know, do you have enough money to replace it? And how much trouble will you run into, practically speaking, if you use that money to replace it? And then it might also depend on your baseline levels of neuroticism. Because what neuroticism is, it's the negative emotion factor in the big five. What neuroticism is a It's a roll of the genetic dice, which says that your body should output X amount of physiological energy or preparation for energy in response to X amount of disruption. And X varies, right? So imagine you're calibrated for a dangerous environment. So on average, the evolutionary dice has designed your genetic system so that you're much more reactive to anomalous or punishing things, anomalous or threatening things, more accurately, punishing as well, than the typical person might be. Now you might say, well, is that right? Like, is that wrong? Is there something wrong with that? It's like, there's nothing wrong with that at all. If it turns out that on average, the environment tends to be much more dangerous than the typical human environment. You know, now it may be kind of rough on you, especially if you have a nervous system that's high in neuroticism, when you're actually not at that much risk, roughly speaking. Then there'd be a mismatch between the genetic roll of the dice and the average safety of the environment. And you know, modern environments are pretty safe, so we all worry about being anxious, which is funny because we're anxious about being anxious. And the reason we can afford to be anxious about being anxious is because we actually don't experience that many punishments compared to what we might have experienced 120 years ago, you know, when the average daily income in corrected dollars for people in North America was under $1 a day. You know, that was hard. So, okay, so anyways, your neuroticism is one of the things that helps determine how much upset you should experience per unit of uncertainty or threat, okay? Another thing is your status among other people. So you might think, well, what else should determine how anxious you get when something you don't want happens? And you might say, well, your competence. And your competence, roughly speaking, should be how good on average are you compared to other people at dealing with problems when they arise. And so competence is actually one of the more, what would you say, cognitive elements of what you might call self-esteem. You know, if it turns out that you're pretty good at problem solving, or it turns out that you actually have a very wide network of social resources, which basically boils down to the same thing, right? It doesn't really matter if you can solve a problem, if you know someone who can solve the problem. So social network and intrinsic computational resources are comparable phenomena. And if you turn out to be a good problem solver, then on average you should be less upset when something is upsetting than someone who isn't a good problem solver. Okay, so that makes sense, I presume. Now, here's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and there's a lot of debate about this in the relevant literature. The terror management people, for example, they claim that people get anxious because they're afraid of death. You know, at a psychological level, it's lurking at the back of their minds all the time. It's an existential problem, and I suppose that's because death is one of those threats that threatens you right at the very top of your hierarchy, right? Good person and dead person don't go well together. So death threatens the entire hierarchy. And so it's very anxiety-provoking, and that seems quite reasonable as a proposition. Now, the other thing that happens in the terror management theories, which are variants of the Freudian theories, is that there's a further claim made, which is that belief systems protect you against death anxiety. Now, this is a complicated claim. Partly, it is extracted from Freud's observation that religious systems are protective against death anxiety. He actually thought they were neurotic protections against death anxiety. So it was sort of like a primitive faith in the ability of the father, roughly speaking, to solve the problem and protect you. So he thought it was a projection of the infantile world onto the broader world.